During the American Civil War, it seemed like there was always a benchmark being broken, whether it was the bloodiest single day in American history, the bloodiest battle in history up until that point. For example, after the first major engagement of the American Civil War, First Manassas, that was considered the bloodiest battle of American history. Well, fast forward a year to September 17th, 1862, and now we have the bloodiest single day in American military history. And some of the most savage fighting of that single day happened right here. We were at the Bloody Lane of Antietam, and we're going to explore this area and hopefully shed some insight as to why this area was just so deadly for both armies involved. Now, the fighting here at Antietam would essentially take place in three different phases. In the early morning hours of this battle on September 17th, 1862, Union and Confederate forces would begin clashing in the area known as the Cornfield, the West Woods, over by the Dunker Church. And if you don't know where the Dunker Church is from this area, you can see the visitor center off in the distance there, right around here. Well, the Dunker Church is just on the other side of that. But as the day progressed, the fighting would shift to this area. And in fact, this area, which is the center of the Confederate line, was considered the weakest, at least from a number standpoint. We obviously know by now that this was a very formidable defensive position. So the Bloody Lane here wasn't always called the Bloody Lane. It was used by local farmers, and it was just an ordinary sunken road that sank over time the more it got used. Well, after September 17th, 1862, as you can see by some of the more iconic images from the battlefield here, this sunken road would be changed forever, and from then on it would be called the Bloody Lane. So just imagine the amount of lead that was being thrown into the air by both armies here. And this is a picture of a section of fence post that was found here, and you can see it's just riddled with lead that was fired here. Gosh, I couldn't imagine. Now, the Confederate forces here were under the command of Confederate Major General Daniel Harvey Hill, and he had just under 3,000 men, and he would place them along this sunken road here, which was used by farmers prior to the battle, and his men would begin fortifying this position, utilizing the fence rails like you see before us here. They'd begin piling those up and making a very strong defensive position. And the Union Army would be approaching from this direction. It's hard to see with the corn here, but this would have been where the Union advanced from. So before we dive into the battle any further, let's head up to this observation tower and let's see if we can get a good sense of the terrain here. It's kind of hard to see from this angle, especially with the corn, but let's see if we can see where the Union would have been attacking from. So just a quick note, the bugs right now in Antietam are absolutely horrendous. It doesn't really bother me too much because I'm from Florida and we got all kinds of prehistoric stuff down there. But just to put it in perspective, imagine these fields covered in bodies that are bloated from the sun. They're starting to decay. Imagine the stench, and then imagine the bugs then. All right, let's head on up. Not quite. We gotta keep on going. And here we are. Good Lord. There was my workout for the day. Wow. So currently we're looking west now, down the Bloody Lane, and you can see the visitor center there in the background, right there. And this is the field where the Union troops would have advanced across. Now, I'm not sure if the entire thing was corn like it is today, because I did read some accounts where the Union was actually able to crest one of these low ridges here in this area and actually fire down into the Bloody Lane here. And now we're transitioning to look north. And if you're having trouble figuring out where you're at, they do have some errors here. So we have Upper Bridge, Prize Ford, Boonesboro, all in this general direction here. But this is looking north. And this is the fields where the Union soldiers would advance across as they assaulted the Bloody Lane here. Now, initially in charge of the Union forces was Major General William H. French, and he had about 5,500 men, and they were initially headed towards the Dunker Church area, where they saw a few Confederate flags poking up from the sunken lane here, and they would veer this direction and begin marching south towards the Bloody Lane. Now, as French's men approached the sunken road, The Confederate troops staggered them with a powerful volley, delivered at a range of less than 100 yards. So you can just imagine how devastating that would have been. Again, to reorient you, the sunken lane, right here, and the fields where the Union troops would assault from. Now, after this initial contact between French and the Confederates on the sunken lane, he would receive reinforcements. About an hour later, 3rd Division of the 2nd Corps, commanded by General Israel Richardson, would move up to support French, and both divisions engage D.H. Hill's Confederate forces that were posted on the sunken road here. Even though the Confederates were outnumbered, this position was a very formidable one, as we're finding out here. Alright, so we're going to head back down, and now we're going to follow in the footsteps of a pretty famous Union brigade that you may or may not heard of, and we're going to assault the Bloody Lane. Alright, well, here is the brigade that we are going to be following in the footsteps in. This is the Irish Brigade, and it seemed like wherever there was heavy fighting, the Irish Brigade was there. Obviously, they were here at Antietam, assaulting the Bloody Lane. They were involved at Fredericksburg, assaulting Marye's Heights. They were involved in the wheat field at Gettysburg. I mean, just time and time again, this brigade was thrown into the thick of it. And I believe by the time they got to Gettysburg, their brigade probably had around 500 able-bodied men. But we're going to advance into the cornfield back here, and we're going to assault the Bloody Lane, walking in the footsteps of the Irish Brigade. So I probably look absolutely ridiculous, but this is how I walk when I'm walking either through the woods or a cornfield like this, because I don't want to walk into spider webs. So the old binder here is bearing the brunt of the force here. So yeah, I'm living in 3022. I don't know about you guys. All right, so we've made our way back into the cornfield. I don't exactly know how far back we are. I would say right around 100 yards. Now, this isn't where the Irish Brigade would start their attack. They would cross the Antietam Creek way back there around 9:30 in the morning, and they would eventually come through this area, assaulting the sunken road here before us. But I figured this was a good starting point because, as you can see, we really can't see anything. Now, I'm pretty sure that not all this was corn at the time of the battle. There was probably a good amount of open field here. And there was also a fence. And as the Irish Brigade came up to this fence, they tore it down while under fire. Alright, so we're slowly making our way through the cornfield back towards the Bloody Lane here. And the Irish Brigade participated in the 4th assault on the sunken lane. Now, the prior 3 assaults had already failed. So now the Irish Brigade has taken the field, and they are commencing the 4th attack here. Now, as they were advancing across this field, Father William Corby was riding back and forth in front of the formation, essentially giving the last rites to the men, which probably wasn't a very good feeling, especially as you're walking over the previous casualties from the attacks before you. Now, as the Irish Brigade continued to make their way across the field, they actually encountered Confederate forces that left the sunken road. And when they got within 30 paces of each other, they began exchanging volleys with one another. And the Irish Brigade volleys had devastating effect. So they carried smoothbore muskets, and instead of firing the traditional mini ball, they fired a round called bucking ball, which was a standard musket ball, and you had 2 or 3 smaller musket balls, probably the size of a BB, and that combination was called buck and ball. And I believe, not in a warfare setting, that was used for hunting. But at close ranges, with the Irish Brigade firing that buck and ball, they began tearing into the Confederate ranks. And then the Irish Brigade would fix bayonets and charge the Confederates that had left the sunken lane, and those Confederates would retreat back to the sunken road. Now, I believe the Irish Brigade would lose almost 540 men advancing across the fields, and they would stay here until given the order to withdraw, and some of the regiments within the brigade were actually out of ammunition. Now, in relief of them was Caldwell's brigade, who was advancing on the right flank of the Confederates, which would be in this direction, or our left. And his men, specifically the 61st and 64th New York, identified a weak point in the Confederate line here. So I can just start to see a piece of the fence rail up ahead, and we're no more than maybe 30 yards from the Bloody Lane here. So that's pretty interesting. So There are probably some spots on this field here where the Union troops would be concealed from the Confederate forces, and when you emerge just out in front of the enemy position here, I'm sure it was a shock to them. Right, so the Irish Brigade has driven the Confederate forces back from the field before the sunken lane, and we're going to continue our assault towards the sunken lane here. Well, that was a small sliver of the Union perspective here at the Bloody Lane. And now we're going to share a few more stories from the Confederate side before we wrap things up here today. All right, so we moved south of the Bloody Lane. You can probably see the observation tower in the background there. And just on the other side of this cornfield here, probably about 100 yards, is the Bloody Lane. Well, this position is significant because this is where a Confederate battery would be placed here in support of the Confederate troops at the sunken lane. Now, this is Miller's battery of the Washington artillery, which was from New Orleans. And as the fighting intensified here, one of these guns would be manned by General Longstreet and his staff in a desperate attempt to drive back the Union forces here. I guess this area took a direct hit and there were several casualties, and Longstreet and his staff stepped up and manned this gun right before us here. So we're back into the sunken lane here, and like we just touched on, Caldwell's brigade advanced around the right flank of the Confederates, so that would have been this way. And they found some advantageous ground. You can kind of see how the ground isn't perfectly flat here. Well, Caldwell's brigade would set up, and they would find ground that kind of overlooked the sunken lane here, and they'd begin firing down into the sunken lane, catching the Confederates in a deadly crossfire. Now, to meet this new threat, Robert Rhodes would give a command to Lieutenant Colonel James Lightfoot, and that order would be misunderstood. Instead of wheeling this way to meet the new Union threat, he ordered his men to about face, and they began pulling back. And all along the Confederate line here, those units would follow Lightfoot's orders and begin pulling back here, thus surrendering the Bloody Lane here at Antietam to the Union forces. Now, another story I want to share with you is there was a colonel by the name of John B. Gordon who was in charge of the 5th Alabama. He would receive 5 wounds in this battle. Now, apparently, legend has it, he would fall face first into his cap, and his cap would begin to fill with blood. But he didn't drown in his own blood because a Union bullet tore through his cap, which allowed the blood to drain from his cap. And he was quoted as saying he was thankful to the Yankee who shot a hole in his hat. I'm not sure how much of that is true, but you can just imagine receiving almost 5 wounds here. So, this is the Bloody Lane at Antietam. Now keep in mind, there was fighting all around this area, and this was one small portion of the Battle of Antietam as a whole, which was the single bloodiest day in American military history. But as you can see, pretty imposing defensive position, and it's always eye-opening to see how a much smaller force can hold off overwhelming numbers when you have a position like this. So, like I always say, catch you on the next one.